Let's begin. But first, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Sky High Stories. He had always walked through life with the quiet arrogance of a man who believed consequences were for others. Confident to the point of carelessness, he was used to getting what he wanted, at work, at home, in relationships. His marriage felt stable enough to survive anything, or so he told himself. His wife had always been patient, forgiving, predictable. In his mind, that made him untouchable. That night unfolded in a blur of flashing lights, laughter, and whispered promises. It could have been a hotel room with drawn curtains, or a party that stretched far past midnight, fueled by alcohol and ego. His phone buzzed with late-night messages, each one feeding the illusion that this secret version of him was more alive, more desired. He ignored the wedding ring on his finger as if it were nothing more than an accessory he could take off when it suited him. Boredom had crept into his marriage long ago, and entitlement followed close behind. He convinced himself he deserved excitement, that one night wouldn't matter. The secrecy thrilled him, the idea that he could step outside his life and slip back in without a trace. He didn't notice how his wife's calls had stopped hours earlier, or how her final message was short, calm, and strangely final. As dawn approached, he dressed quietly, confidence still intact. He checked his reflection, straightened his collar, and smiled to himself. By the time he drove home, the sky was lightening and the city was waking up. He had no idea that while he was chasing pleasure, his wife was closing a chapter for good, and that the life he was returning to no longer existed. While he was convincing himself that the night meant nothing, she was living through the moment everything finally made sense. From the outside, she appeared calm, almost eerily so. There were no frantic calls, no dramatic confrontations, no accusations hurled into the darkness. But inside, something fragile and precious was breaking beyond repair. She hadn't needed a confession. The truth revealed itself quietly, through a combination of instinct and undeniable proof. A message that popped up on his phone when he wasn't there. A call that went unanswered for hours. A familiar name paired with unfamiliar intimacy. Her intuition, sharpened by years of small disappointments and unexplained absences, filled in the gaps he thought he had hidden so well. In that moment, denial was no longer an option. The pain hit her all at once, heavy and suffocating. She sat alone, replaying memories, questioning herself, wondering how long she had been the only one still honoring their vows. Yet even as her heart shattered, her expression remained composed. She knew confronting him in the heat of discovery would only give him excuses, lies, and temporary remorse. She refused to give him the satisfaction of watching her beg for honesty or loyalty. Instead, silence became her shield. She didn't ask where he was. She didn't demand explanations. That quiet was not weakness, it was clarity. Somewhere between heartbreak and resolve, a decision formed. She stopped questioning her worth, stopped hoping for apologies, and started planning her exit. This wasn't about revenge or drama. It was about dignity. By the time he thought he was getting away with betrayal, she had already chosen herself. And in that choice, the marriage he believed was secure had quietly come to an end. Once the shock settled, she moved with quiet precision. There were no emotional outbursts, no late-night arguments waiting for his return. Instead, she began collecting evidence, carefully and methodically, as if protecting herself from further heartbreak. Screenshots of messages, call logs, dates that didn't align with his stories, each piece confirmed what her heart already knew. She worked in silence, understanding that truth was her strongest armor. As she gathered proof, memories resurfaced uninvited. Late dinners that made no sense. Sudden password changes. A phone turned face down, always within reach. Moments when her questions were dismissed as insecurity or overthinking. At the time, she had chosen trust over suspicion, love over doubt. Now, those ignored warnings formed a painful pattern she could no longer deny. There was a moment, quiet but decisive, when reality fully settled in. She realized that love, no matter how deep or sincere, could not save a marriage built on betrayal and disrespect. Staying would mean accepting a life of constant fear and self-doubt. Leaving meant reclaiming her dignity. For the first time in a long while, The choice felt clear. She reached out to someone she trusted, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. A lawyer explained her options calmly, professionally, without judgment. With each conversation, her resolve hardened. This was no longer an emotional reaction. It was a deliberate decision. Standing alone afterward, she made herself a promise she would not break. This ends on my terms. And once that vow was made, there was no turning back. He returned home just after sunrise, exhaustion clinging to him, yet a smug sense of relief followed close behind. The night was over, the secrets safely tucked away, at least, that's what he believed. He unlocked the door expecting the familiar rhythm of his life to resume, maybe a cold silence or a half-hearted question he could easily deflect. Instead, he was met with something far more unsettling. The house was quiet. Not the tense kind of quiet that follows an argument, but a hollow, echoing stillness. No clatter from the kitchen. No movement from the bedroom. Even the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if something essential had already been removed. The unfamiliar calm unsettled him more than anger ever could. He waited for shouting, for tears, for accusations that would allow him to defend himself. None came. There was no confrontation, no demand for explanations, no emotional storm waiting to break. The silence pressed in, heavy and deliberate. Then he noticed it. A single envelope placed neatly on the table, positioned where he couldn't miss it. His name was written clearly on the front, the handwriting unmistakably hers. At first, confusion flickered across his face. Why paperwork? Why now? As he picked it up, a strange unease crept into his chest. The confidence he carried home began to crack. His hands felt heavier, his breath shallower. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And as he stood there in the stillness of the house he thought he controlled, confusion slowly gave way to a creeping sense of dread he couldn't explain away. He sat down at the table expecting, at worst, a conversation he could manage. Instead, he unfolded the documents and felt the ground shift beneath him. Divorce papers. The words stared back at him, sharp and undeniable. For a long moment, he simply read them again and again, convinced he was misunderstanding something. This had to be a threat, a scare tactic, anything but real. Shock hit first, freezing him in place. Then denial rushed in just as quickly. She wouldn't actually do this, he told himself. Not without a fight. Not without tears. Anger followed close behind, hot and defensive. How dare she make such a drastic decision without confronting him? Without giving him a chance to explain? His mind scrambled for excuses, for ways to shift the blame. He told himself it had been a mistake. One reckless night. Nothing that should erase years of marriage. He rehearsed apologies in his head, already planning how he would minimize the betrayal, frame it as temporary weakness rather than deliberate choice. Surely she would listen once he spoke to her face to face. But as he continued reading, panic crept in. This wasn't impulsive. The paperwork was precise, organized, thorough. Dates, signatures, legal language, everything was in place. She hadn't written this in anger that morning. She had prepared it carefully, long before he walked through the door. That realization hit harder than the papers themselves. She had known. She had planned. And she had acted while he was busy indulging himself. In that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. The man who thought he held control now understood he was reacting to a decision already made, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By the time he began to process the divorce papers, she was already gone. Not just physically, but emotionally, every trace of her presence carefully removed, leaving behind a silence that screamed louder than any argument ever could. There were no shouting matches, no accusatory words, no desperate confrontations. Just absence. The emptiness in the house was suffocating, heavy with meaning, and it hit him harder than he expected. On the kitchen table, a simple note lay waiting, written in her familiar, steady handwriting. It wasn't long or dramatic, but every word cut deep. The brevity of it, the calm certainty, conveyed far more than tears or yelling ever could. He picked it up, reread it, but the weight of what it symbolized couldn't be undone. The message was clear. She had moved on mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. As he walked through the house, the small details of her life became impossible to ignore. Her favorite mug was gone, the bookshelf rearranged, clothes and personal items missing. Each empty space screamed of what he had lost. Memories hit him all at once, laughing in the kitchen, quiet evenings together, moments of intimacy he had taken for granted. The arrogance that had carried him through his life, the careless confidence in his entitlement, began to crumble. He realized, painfully, that her absence was a mirror reflecting his failures. Regret replaced pride, guilt replaced justification. And in that quiet, empty house, he finally understood the full cost of his choices, and that some doors, once closed, could never be reopened. Panic pushed him into action. He reached for his phone, dialing her number again and again, convinced that if he could just hear her voice, he could fix this. Each call went unanswered. He sent messages next, long apologies, desperate explanations, promises he had never made before. His words tumbled over one another, frantic and unfiltered, as if volume alone could undo betrayal. When a response finally came, it wasn't what he expected. It was brief, calm, firm. There were no insults, no emotional outbursts, no room for negotiation. She didn't argue about what happened or ask for details. She simply stated her boundaries and reminded him that the decision had already been made. Any further communication, she said, would go through her lawyer. That was the moment reality settled in. This wasn't anger that would fade. This wasn't pain that could be soothed with apologies and affection. She wasn't waiting for him to fight for the marriage. She had already walked away from it. The woman who once pleaded to be heard now spoke with clarity and distance. The contrast was brutal. He unraveled in real time, pacing the empty house, replaying his choices, bargaining with regret. Meanwhile, she moved forward with quiet resolve, her calm a reflection of closure, not indifference. For the first time, he felt the true weight of what he had done. Betrayal wasn't just a mistake, it was a decision with consequences. And now those consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real, permanent, and entirely his to carry alone. Days passed, and the reality he had been avoiding settled in with brutal clarity. The divorce was real. Friends began to ask questions he didn't know how to answer. Family members looked at him differently, their disappointment unspoken but obvious. Financial discussions replaced casual conversations, and the future he once took for granted suddenly felt unstable and uncertain. The life he thought was secure had unraveled faster than he could process. Emotionally, the fallout was relentless. Guilt lingered, mixed with regret and a hollow sense of loss. He replayed moments he once ignored, realizing too late how much trust he had destroyed. The house no longer felt like home. It was a reminder of what he had thrown away. Every consequence traced back to a single choice he had dismissed as harmless. Meanwhile, she was building something new. Away from the noise, she found peace in simplicity. Mornings were quieter, decisions lighter. For the first time in years, she didn't have to question loyalty or brace herself for disappointment. Freedom didn't come from revenge or public vindication. It came from choosing self-respect over suffering. She didn't celebrate his downfall or seek validation from his regret. Walking away was her victory. By refusing to stay where she was disrespected, she reclaimed her power. The lesson was unmistakable. Betrayal always carries a cost, even when it feels momentary. One night can dismantle a lifetime, and no apology can undo a deliberate choice. In the end, he was left facing the ruins of his actions, while she stepped forward into a future defined not by pain, but by strength. Trust, once broken, cannot simply be repaired. It can only guide the choices we make afterward. That single night of betrayal didn't just shatter a marriage, it reshaped two lives forever. One person chased temporary thrill, blind to the consequences, while the other chose strength, dignity, and self-respect over despair. Every choice carries weight, and every action leaves a mark far beyond the moment it occurs. The night changed everything. What seemed like a fleeting mistake became a defining moment, a turning point that revealed character, priorities, and the stark difference between selfishness and integrity. She walked away, not out of spite, but out of courage. He was left to face the aftermath of his own decisions, alone and unprepared for the life-altering consequences he had ignored. Let this story remind us, betrayal may feel thrilling in the moment, but strength, clarity, and self-respect endure. In the end, it's not the heartbreak that defines us, it's how we rise after it. Choices have a cost, and some nights change everything forever.